All right, welcome back to these videos for your lessons in History 1301. By now you're deeply into the course. I hope you've already completed 2 units and you're about to begin the longest unit of the semester. There's a lot of content in that lesson folder on Blackboard. Try to work through it all, starting with this video. Hopefully that will kind of set the tone for you and give you some important highlights for information that you will be learning in this unit. We call it competition and control for a number of reasons. I would say that the major themes of this unit pertain to the competitive drive that these 5 European empires culturally developed prior to the Age of Exploration, which we called the Oceanic Revolution, right? Remember all that stuff from the previous unit? Well, once all that stuff breaks out, you got these big 5 empires are competing with each other for land, for territory, for power, for those 3 G's. Make sure you understand those 3 G's, right? And we call it control because they're competing with each other for control over these areas of the colonial world, or what they describe as the colonial world, right? These empires, they have things that they call periphery zones, core versus periphery. That's a term you might hear in this unit that you also want to pay attention to. The core being, say, for example, London, or what they would call the metropole, right? The center of a empire and its activity. Those who are on the highest food chain in that empire, so to speak. And the periphery would be the outskirts, right? And you'll notice that at least from the metropole's perspective, the periphery is designed to benefit the core. That's why they send people out to the periphery, collect resources, bring them back, right? You'll catch a lot of conversation in the next unit about something called the Navigation Acts, which several of these empires, like the English Empire, established to try to ensure that the people they send out there bring those resources back to the empire. You remember that term mercantilism? Or if you don't, then you may learn more about it in this unit. But these were mercantilist empires. These were empires that were built on this idea that trade needs to benefit us as the empire, that if we're sending people out into the empire, that they need to be getting goods and services and bringing them back to us. Like Englishmen don't need to be going out there getting things to sell to the French Empire under the mercantilist philosophy, because there's only so much amount of wealth out there. They measured wealth by bullion, by resources, by concrete things. There wasn't really much of a service industry yet like you see in your society today. So people measured wealth like, for example, imagine I have a piece of pie. I can cut that, or I have an entire pie. I can cut that pie up into however many pieces I want, but the minute I take a piece out and eat it, it's gone and it's never coming back. These empires thought about wealth in this regard. There's only a certain amount of wealth out there, right? And we need to make laws and establish rules and regulations that are designed to allow us to benefit the most out of that wealth, right? And that's why we call the big theme of this unit competition and control. I want you to pay attention to those 5 European empires that embarked upon the Age of Exploration and established settler colonialism, or another term that we use is colonization projects, right? Each of these 5 European empires, which you should know who started, which ones, kind of generally something about them all, right? Like the Spanish, for example, were one of the most powerful at first, but then they later on started to dwindle. Eventually, the British, who become British in 1707. Prior to that, they're called the English Empire. They become you'll see in the next unit how they become the most powerful of the 5. But each one of these empires had their own kind of flavor, or approach, or cultural lens, or mindset that they used to embark upon the Age of Exploration. But there is one thing that they all have in common, right? And you'll see this in the first section of your textbook for this chapter: the transatlantic slave trade. Let me tell you, man, there's a lot of disturbing material out there on the transatlantic slave trade. You saw a book review in this unit about a book that I just read, which was the most disturbing book I think I've ever read in my life. The more you study about the transatlantic slave trade, the more you see how disturbing it is. And you also, I think, develop a sense of sort of shock at how little we actually know and how much misinformation there is out there on a transatlantic slave trade. Out of all the topics I've ever lectured about, studied about, did research on, the transatlantic slave trade is probably the most misunderstood. It is probably the most difficult for students to grasp the significance of, because there's so much misinformation out there. It's one of those topics where so many people have opinions about what it is without ever actually going to the primary sources. I mean, really. And that's a problem. I didn't know much about the transatlantic slave trade until I became a PhD student and took on the field of study known as the African diaspora as one of my teaching fields of expertise. I studied with a brilliant professor at UTA who's now retired, named Alassane Jallo, who now is back in Sierra Leone in his hometown after retiring from UTA. And before I took his courses as a PhD student, as I said, I didn't know very much about the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, I knew what it was, but I didn't know the detailed historiography of it. That's a big fancy word that you should pay attention to if you don't know already. You may have heard it in the orientation edition, or you may have heard it in the what is history topics, right? What are the tools that historians use? We talked a lot about primary sources, secondary sources, but historiography is a field, a subset of history. It's like historiography is the history of something, if that makes any sense. So, like, take the transatlantic slave trade, for example. If you were to write a historiographical paper or a historiography of the transatlantic slave trade, then what you would be doing is writing a history of how other historians have written about the transatlantic slave trade. So, in other words, you wouldn't be writing a book using primary sources to tell a story or provide a position or an interpretation of what happened. Instead, in a historiography paper, you would be reading as many books as you can that have been written about the transatlantic slave trade, and you would compare them to try to find trends or to try to find patterns, or to try to tease out what the interpretation that these sources are providing are, right? And this is an important exercise, right? In fact, when you're writing a historical research paper, when you get into graduate school, you have to write these, a historical research paper, about 25 page research paper about a historical topic of some sort. Usually you like to start with the historiography of the topic that you're writing about, so that you can kind of say, look, this is what other historians have said about this topic, and now I'm going to show you where my interpretation fits in, right? So, if you were to do a historiography of the transatlantic slave trade, then you would find a significant shift in the way people writing about the subject interpreted its significance, right? Like, for example, if you take Philip Ulrich's book from like the early 1900s, a white Southern, highly racist historian, you're going to hear him give an entirely different interpretation of what the transatlantic slave trade was compared to a, historian in the post-1960s civil rights era, where black people in the United States now have more civil rights and more of a voice. And you're going to start to see people changing the narrative of the way they approach telling the stories, right? Like for today, for example, you got all kinds of new interpretations of the transatlantic slave trade emerging. Michael Gomez, in fact, here's a book right here by Judith Carney called in the shadow of slavery. I do this a lot, when we're not in the Corona curse, when we're in class, I'll bring books because I got a massive mountain I got an addiction when it comes to books. I buy them and I can't stop it. But I usually bring them into class to show people. But this is a great book that I've been reading for a while that gives you a prime example of what I'm talking about. Here in this book, which was published, in the 2000s, you're going to get an interpretation about history, about the transatlantic slave trade that focuses on slave agency, that focuses on what enslaved people contributed to the Atlantic world. Another term that I think you should be paying attention to right now, right? You'll catch that term Atlantic world, which is sort of like a historical frame. It's a way of organizing history. We're looking at history from the perspective of all these people that are coming back and forth, moving across the Atlantic from the Americas, from Europe, from Africa, and all the interconnections that take place with them after that Columbian moment, right? This book talks about the agencies. You talk about like Africans bringing rice with them to plant in the Carolinas so they can have something they're familiar with to eat, and that really transforms the landscape. And those who are doing the enslaving eventually adopt rice, or enslaved Africans bringing cannabis seeds with them across the Atlantic to plant for their own consumption, to help them provide a medicine in order to cope with the dehumanizing, brutal labor regimes that they had to deal with at the plantation complex. By the way, another term, the plantation complex, that you should be able to define, that I'm sure you'll have a quiz question over in this unit, right? Anyways, the point I'm trying to make here is this concept of agency. When you read books about the transatlantic slave trade that were written, in our time, in our lifetime, you're going to get a much different interpretation from those people who were writing 100 years ago. And that's what we mean by historiography. You sort of look at those patterns, right? And to bring this back to one of my initial points, if you do that, you'll notice, if you do the historiography of the transatlantic slave trade, then you'll notice that it is one of the most misunderstood topics that at least I have ever encountered, because so many people have so many different perspectives that aren't based off of truth, and they're more based off of bias. I'll give you an example. This is a pretty well-established trend that the data will show if you do a historiography of the transatlantic slave trade. You'll notice, for example, that historians who are white tend to provide numbers of the amount of people who were taken from Africa that are far lower than what we actually know. In turn, if you take historians who are black, they oftentimes will send or provide numbers of the amount of people who are taken that are higher than what we actually know. And it's very difficult to determine how much we know. I mean, today we have a general knowledge. I mean, if you look at the transatlantic slave trade database online, it's somewhere between 10 to 12 million people that we know for sure that were taken across the Atlantic from the 1500s to the 1800s. Could be a lot more. Definitely is not less. But you get the point I'm trying to talk about, right? This is why cultural lens is so important. And this is also why you got to be wary of your own cultural lens, and you got to be wary of the fact that other people have these cultural lenses, right? So keep all this stuff in mind as we're talking here, or as you're reading through this unit, and going through a lot of this information, which is going to be a lot. Okay, this is one of the most difficult units that I think you'll find. You're going to be talking a lot about what's going on in colonial Virginia, where white Virginians were caught up in a system that measured your social distinction based upon ownership of slaves. But then again, you're also going to go in and look at haciendas in Spanish Atlantic world, or you'll look at the trade empires of the Dutch. You got a lot of stuff to deal with and unpack during this unit. You also have a slave cell poster to kind of look at that comes from Virginia, which makes a lot of references to Africans in Guinea. I think that's kind of interesting because, we always we have a tendency to think of slave people as units, as dehumanized objects. But really, if you look at the resources, even those individuals who were perpetuating the slave trade uh, actually sought out specific groups of Africans for their skill sets. They said we want people from Guinea or from Angola because we've heard that they know how to uh, cultivate rice, or the Fula cattle ranchers who are expert cow herders. Remember what you learned in chapter one, is that Africa is the birthplace of humanity, the birthplace of civilization. Um, they're expert traders. There's all these different things that we know of Africa that people were seeking out, which really debunks that mentality or theory of the dark continent that you'll hear people describe when they're referring to